Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of I Like to Read with me, your host, Rachel Polanski. Today, I am very delighted to be joined by Christina Sweeney-Baird, the author of The End of Men, which is a fantastic novel that I reviewed, I think, a month or two ago, around when it came out on the podcast. So welcome, Christina. We're very excited to have you here. If you'd like to give the listeners / viewers a brief introduction before we dive into you, go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you very much for having me. So I'm a writer. I live in London. I also work as a corporate litigation lawyer, which means that I don't sleep a huge amount between writing and lawyering, but I really enjoy doing both. The End of Men is my debut novel, and it was released in US and Canada and the UK at the end of April, and is going to be released in 19 different territories, which is very exciting.
That's exciting, yeah.
And in very, very, very brief summation, it is about a world in which a pandemic to which women are immune kills 90% of the world's men. So it's set between 2025 and 2031. And it's a hyper-realistic speculative fiction novel that explores what would change about the world and what would stay the same through a number of different characters, some women and some men. And you see how their lives change. You kind of follow them in a first-person narration style. So you really see what the world would look like without men.
I thought that was so fascinating. I mean, so you conceptual, obviously, it's a pandemic novel that was released during a pandemic, which was coincidental. What was it like to, have this conceptualization? What was the inspiration? Because obviously you thought of it before the pandemic. And then follow-up question to that, then what was it like to release this into the world during a pandemic?
So the timing is so weird. I had the idea for the book in early 2018.
Okay, wow.
I started writing it in September 2018 and then finished writing it in December 2019. So, I mean, it really was well before the pandemic. And then in the editing process, my editor and I really tried to change as little as possible to preserve this kind of pre-COVID imaginative exercise. So the timing has just been so bizarre. And I think it's important for me to make sure people know that, so they know that it wasn't in any way
right. That's why I wanted to, that's the first thing I wanted.
It was very much just this odd coincidence.
Right.
So the timing was very weird, but in terms of how I had the idea, I had recently read The Power by Naomi Alderman, which is a book that I think really opened my mind to using speculative fiction as a way and to kind of see how you can explore what the world looks like, if men and women's roles, I suppose, are so fundamentally changed, which is another book I love. That really contributed to the narrative style of the book and this kind of multi-character style. Those were really the core things that the idea came from. And it just felt like such an interesting question, like what would the world look like without the majority of men? What jobs would we do and how would they change? How would our interpersonal lives change? There was just so much to talk about.
Right. And what was, so in, a spoiler is like, sort of light spoilers that 90% of the men pass away, but there is this 10% of men who are immune to the virus. So what came with the decision to sort of keep that like small facet of men, but then, slowly shift them, of course, to now being the extreme minority versus killing all of them off?
So it was partly that I thought that it actually made for a much more tense book.
Yeah.
If you still have some men surviving, you have this real question throughout. Are they going to survive or are they not? Whereas it felt like if all the men died, then actually you were just kind of waiting for them to die. And also in a practical way, they meant that it was more interesting to me because if all men genuinely did die, the world would pretty quickly end. You'd be like, okay, well, this generation essentially is finished because we cannot biologically be humans without men. So it felt more interesting in terms of the world having some hope, that there was hope moving forward. There was actually something to try and create a vaccine for, try and move forward, and then you could explore what the world looked like after 2 years and 6 years. And that's the book finishes after 6 years. So it was both an emotional, I felt like it was important to have hope, and also a practical one. I think it made for a more interesting book.
Yeah, I think it's without men, totally, I think the world would be different, but having, this small facet and the hope too, because there are a few men who do survive, and then the different women that we experience and the way that their relationships with their respective men in their lives, like the slow dread / hope combination, I think is like a really tenuous balance that you capture so well. And then there's first person narration. We follow the different, our primary women and how they deal with the pandemic and sort of this anthropological way. Who would you say you relate to the most, and who was like the hardest person to really get into?
So I think that the person I relate to the most is Amanda McLean, who is a doctor. She is Glaswegian, and I grew up in Glasgow. I don't sound very Scottish. My family's from Glasgow. We moved back there when I was 14. So she felt like a grounding person. Doctors who were very funny and dry. In their mid-40s, a lot of my friends' kind of parents, I suppose, were like that. So Amanda is the person who discovers the virus. She's very no nonsense. Like, she just feels like someone I would sit and have a drink with very happily, and we'd have a glass of wine together at Lord Rides. I think the person I found the most difficult in some ways was Elizabeth, who is a virologist who comes across to the UK from the States right near the beginning to help, and then gets essentially stranded in the UK. That's spoiler, that's kind of part of her character's premise. And she's really, really important to me, though. She wasn't this like one-dimensional Pollyanna, Dora the Explorer character who was just like more complex than that. And, it was important to me that on the one hand, her story was kind of rich and textured, and at the same time, she is someone who genuinely just wants to do the right thing. Like, that's her North Star. So I think she was the hardest to write, but actually some of the scenes with her are my favorite. I think her story is quite satisfying in its conclusion, and you see her go from being a very nervous person in her kind of mid-20s who is doing this really scary thing and is very overwhelmed, to being, I think, a much more confident woman who's survived, a pandemic and a complete nightmare.
Right. Like, everyone goes through it and deals with it differently, but she definitely has a big arc and, a little bit bigger in some ways than others. I'd love to learn a little bit more about like your past before writing. So you mentioned that you are now a barrister. Forgive me if that's that's the right term. Is that what and I'd love to learn, where your interest in writing came from, where your interest in law came from, and then how those sort of navigate and interplay as you're, writing and putting a book out into the world.
So my parents are both lawyers, so I half joke that I really didn't use a lot of imagination to figure out. But I grew up. My mum was a law professor. She now runs a charity, and my dad still works as a restructuring and insolvency lawyer in the UK. So, like, they just both really loved and found and find really interesting. So I kind of grew up at a dinner table where it was discussed all the time. So it felt natural for me to study law, which I did, and I really loved it as a degree. I think it's in the UK, I think it's quite different maybe in the US, because you do it as an degree. And the degree I did at Cambridge involved a lot of kind of critical thinking about how the world should maybe change, what the law is, but what the law should be. And I think that connects actually very well to speculative fiction. You are essentially exploring an alternative world that is quite similar to ours, and this big what if question. So I think there's actually a much closer line, I suppose, between the law that I studied and now practice and writing into writing. I always did, but very secretly. I didn't talk about it. I was never that person who was like, let me out my short story. I just secretly wrote and loved novels. I always wanted to write novels, focused on that, and just kind of worked away at it. I started trying to write a novel for the first time, I think, when I was 15. I say trying, as in I wrote like 2 chapters, but just kept going and gradually over the years managed to write, I suppose. No, but I mean, you hear of people writing like a complete novel at 16 or whatever. That wasn't me. But by the time I was 23, I had a lot of beginnings of novels, and I was getting a bit fed up, and I thought, no, like enough of this now. I've been writing the beginnings of novels for years. I have to finish a novel if I'm going to get anywhere. And I wrote a whole novel that before the end of end that never got published. And so I do say to people, don't be surprised if you are a writer yourself, if it takes you more than one book to get an agent or to get published, because I think that's actually much more commonly people's experience.
Is that book going to be published at some point, or is that sort of just like a first draft that will never see the light of day?
it is a first draft that will never see the light of day. And I say that with like kind of love and gratitude.
Yeah. Of course.
It was a good experience. But I remember my agent read it. Yeah. Because I said to her, I was like, you should read it. Like, you might as well have done, the work. And she and I both agree that the best way to learn how to write a novel is to write a novel.
Oh, I think I may have lost you for a second. Christina, are you there? The joys.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay, you can hear me. Okay, cool. Yeah, I can hear you. Fine. Perfect. I mean, it's impressive. This is the joys of 2021, the fact you're across the pond and we're still able to have this conversation, which, is better than it would have been. I don't even know when Zoom started as a thing, because that would be interesting, the history of Zoom and the history of FaceTime. So there's a lot of like science and a lot of, it is a pandemic and there is a virus. How much scientific research and how much, more research that had to go outside of your comfort zone did you do versus sort of just like an intuitive, writing from the heart sort of thing?
So alas, much of the science really require a lot of research. And I say that as someone who did not study science, past the age of 16. So I spent a lot of time reading virology journals and trying to understand public health responses to pandemics and what the most likely cause of a pandemic would be. So all of that science stuff is really grounded in research. And I wanted it to be feasible. I wanted someone with some science background to be able to read it and go, no, this makes sense. It didn't have to be 100% because it's fiction, but it needed to be feasible. And one of the things I found kind of odd, of course, is that people now read the book with far more knowledge of pandemics than I ever would have expected. And they go, right. Oh, like, did you edit it post-COVID? Include phrases like social distancing. And I say, no, those phrases, that terminology was present within public health literature, many, many years ago. This is not, This is the first time we've had a global pandemic of this scale in a century. But this is not the first pandemic we've had. So that stuff was all research-based. But in terms of exploring how the world would change if 90% of the world's men died, that really did have to be intuitive, primarily because actually a lot of that research hasn't actually been done. We often don't disaggregate data based on sex. There's a really good book I recommend on this called Invisible Woman by Caroline Criado Perez, which is literally about the gender data gap, as she calls it. So a lot of that stuff couldn't be researched. And I just had to imagine what I thought would stay the same because I didn't really have, that information available to me.
Right. And I think that, maybe we'll look back at your book as a piece, even though it is speculative fiction at the time, I think there's a lot of speculative fiction that comes out. And then as little as 2 years, maybe, 5-10 years later, a very similar event can happen. And I think it's interesting. There's a lot that if the pandemic hadn't happened, or I wonder, if somehow your book had come out like right before the pandemic, if there's even more that we could have taken from it. And I wonder if it could have even really like changed the scope of the pandemic. Speculative fiction about the speculative fiction, basically.
It is it can quite quickly become so meta. And I've had quite a few people kind of call me Cassandra. And it's so odd to imagine if the book had come out, before the pandemic. And I wonder if people would have read it and gone, this is ridiculous. Whereas now, certainly the beginning, I think there are elements of it that feel very familiar. But I do always say to people, remember that it's not COVID. The pandemic in the book is very different. It only affects, it has this mortality rate of 90%. So I think hopefully it does quite quickly feel like you're reading a book about an alternative world. And I've had a few people say happily that it's really helped them process what's happened over the last year, that it's actually made them feel a lot better about the world we're living in, because the pandemic in the book is so much worse.
Right. Yeah. And I think the fact that we're able to sort of see the light at the end of the tunnel, which is really beautiful. I think there's, whether they came out during the pandemic or before, there's of course lots of speculative sort of pandemic, whether it's more like a zombie apocalypse type thing, whether it is more of like a disease science-based thing, but we don't often get to see sort of what happens in the aftermath, or the aftermath is sort of just like an epilogue. And I think it's really great that while the book is sort of incited by the pandemic and, the different sort of pandemic, it's really about how the women and how society changes, and then how we deal with it after, and how the people, how we move on, and how society can heal. And I think that's what's really beautiful about this, and what stuck out for me amongst many other things. But I think that was really what it was, just a very complete sort of, of course, it's still an ending where we're not exactly sure where the world is going to go, but we get a lot of the aftermath and the picking up the pieces in a way that a lot of other forms of media don't necessarily touch on.
Thank you. And I'm so glad you say that, because I have a real thing about endings. I don't love an ambiguous ending. That's partly just a taste thing. I love an ending where I feel like it's been well plotted, it's been planned. Yes. Because yes, okay, this is satisfying. I'm glad I've read 400 pages to get to this point. And so it was really important to me that the book was ultimately very hopeful. There was a real optimism to it. I say that it's not a utopian world where everyone's thrilled that the men have gone. And it's not dystopian, it's not like a reverse Handmaid's Tale. I think it's truly what I think would happen if 90% of the world's men died. And ultimately, I have a lot of faith in humans, ability to be resilient and to move forward. So the ending, very purposely for that 6-year time period, allows you enough time to see how these characters are maybe getting into a new form of normality, as opposed to still being in like the absolute middle of, the disaster zone.
Right. I think that it's great to see sort of the different people and the way that they pick up the pieces versus, you mentioned The Handmaid's Tale. And are you watching the show? What are your thoughts? Are you still watching it? I know, obviously, I'm sure you got some comparisons, especially more to Margaret Atwood's book, because I don't know, my gripes about the TV show, I'm going a little off tangent, but I feel like that's speaking of endings, where it's a show that there's a lot of rich text already there. There's already such a rich plot, and they kind of went a little bit off the rails with it. And sometimes when you're going into this like speculative dystopian or faux utopian society, you do have to be grounded, and it does have to be well plotted. And I feel like maybe because it's a TV show and it's not a book, but it does sometimes go a little bit off the rails. And that's, again, back to The End of Men. That's just why I felt like it was really just like so thoughtful, but also real. It didn't feel like, it felt really sort of what would happen. And I think that's what's so great about your writing. I think you're really able to have a speculative but realistic view of looking at the world.
Thank you. So I'm actually not watching the show because I only read the book, The Handmaid's Tale, a few months ago, which is a very embarrassing thing to admit as a writer of feminist speculative fiction. It had been on my list to read so long. And then I read it a few months ago and was just blown away. I'm extraordinary novel, and it's amazing, the world building by Margaret Atwood in that book. It's like 300 pages.
I know, that's what's so fascinating. I mean, amongst other things, but yeah, the way Gilead,
Sorry, I think I've got a delay.
Oh, can you hear me?
I can't hear you.
Okay.
Sorry, I think I've got a bad delay. You go.
No, you go ahead. You were talking about the world building, and then I think it got cut off.
No, you go. Well, and then I will go.
But it's okay. Well, imagine if, it's hard enough. It's interesting, sometimes it's hard enough doing this. And then the fact that during the pandemic and, people have to make these like global, huge decisions or lack of decisions in this sort of communication way. So it's fascinating to think that this, and I've seen it in different sorts of events as well. How do you feel like exploring the relationships and the idea of heteronormativity, because of course 90% of the men are gone and women still have this urge for relationships and this urge for a community that extends beyond just sort of a platonic way. How did you go about exploring that sort of dynamic?
So that was one of the ways in which it was really important to me to have multiple character perspectives. And I felt like it was really important because realistically, humans contain multitudes. I think there would be some, and, I do think you would have some people who have a more fluid sexuality who would be completely open to having a relationship with another woman. I think there'd be some people who would go, nope, that's just not for me. And I think there would be just such a range of responses. So it was something that was really important to me to explore, and how it would work with men suddenly being this minority, women being in power. How would that shift sexuality? How much would that pandemic? And actually, that's something that weirdly I found was happening during the real life COVID, was that, people were still going on dates because, the world doesn't end, I suppose, just because there isn't a apocalypse happening. And so that has been a weird, where there's a scene where one of the characters goes on a date, and it's the first date she's been on in like 2.5 years, because she's been working in a pandemic, and she's just so finding it interesting for me to then see in the real world happening. But yeah, in terms of heteronormative, I think that one of the ways I deal with it in the book is that there's a character called Maria who is a journalist, and so she kind of writes about the issue, and that felt to me like one of the most natural ways, I suppose, to explore that issue and how people would be responding to it in this imagined world.
Definitely. I think that having a journal, you're seeing the different ways that women, but also just people would respond to these. I mean, it's sort of the natural human response beyond just sort of the traditional like gender response. So what was it like? I know we talked a little bit about it earlier, but the decision to sort of create these different characters and create their different points of views. How did the sort of main characters emerge? And then also going off of that, how did the decision come about to also include these little side characters and these little vignettes, which I really enjoyed. I think I love a multi-perspective novel, and I think the richer, the better. And I don't think you always have to center on the same people. Sometimes to get just a little snippet of someone you never see again, I think is how the world works. So how did that sort of narrative decision come about?
So the main characters were, in some ways, I suppose it was quite practical, because as I was writing the first draft, I actually had a lot more characters. In the first draft, I had, I think, 40 or 50 perspectives, and each character was only there once. So it was much more like the style of World War Z. So it was quite, it was, you'd have the doctor, Amanda McLean, who first treated patient zero, and you'd have a virologist, Lisa Michael, trying to find a vaccine. And so those were the reasons why I came up with characters. And then my agent and I went through this process in late 2019 of really redrafting the book, and we culled it down into this core group of perspectives. And that felt quite natural that Amanda, the doctor, and, Lisa Michael, the virologist, Dawn, who's a civil servant in the UK, just trying to like keep the country's lights on, would be some of the core characters. And then one of them that was more consciously created was Catherine. So Catherine is really the heart of the novel. She's living in London. She's not got anything to do with science or the pandemic, really. She has a husband and a young son, and she's just desperately trying to keep her life together and keep them safe. And so she was a creation of the second draft, and I now can't imagine the book without her. But so it really made sense to have someone who was not a pandemic expert, who was not a doctor, who was just like trying to keep her family safe. And I think you kind of see the world through her eyes the most. And then the vignettes are, I suppose, in some ways a hangover from that first draft. There were some characters that I just enjoyed too much to let go. And my editor and I, were really careful about what we included. But the 3 or 4 vignettes we included, we did feel like added a lot to the world, and, had a character that you could believe, even if you only were with them for like 2,500 or 3,000 words.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's and also that's kind of how life works too, is sometimes we encounter these people, in a different situation, at a party maybe, or we're going out to the store and we only see them for 2 minutes, but they have this whole inner life too. And we, that's not always explored in traditional multi-perspective novels. So I think it was really cool to include that. I do think 40 or 50 perspectives would have definitely been, it would have been a different novel, I think, because we also grow to connect with these different people. And I'm assuming in the vignettes that it was sort of a one and done type thing. So I think the way that we're also able to revisit these people at different points during the pandemic and also its aftermath, as like, do you feel like the first draft was almost like more of like a little bit of like short stories connected to each other? And do you feel like you were able to really delve into the characters by spending more time with them and allowing them to like breathe a little bit more on the page?
For sure. It is a completely different novel, as you say, with the characters coming back. And it's a much, much better novel. It did feel like a collection of short stories with a string between them. Yeah. Whereas now it is hopefully, I think, a really emotionally engaging novel. People tell me that it makes them cry and it makes them laugh at times. And that is so important, I think. But that first draft had such value in terms of world building. It meant that I'd really thought through, every different aspect and in different countries. And one of the difficulties is obviously trying to fit, you can't fit everything in, and trying to show this global story in a way that is both emotionally engaging and you get to connect with people and see their stories through to the end. And also that means that some stuff just can't be included. You can't include everything. Right. So I think we got the balance right, that there's enough people that you can see a lot of different aspects, but exactly, you're not kind of constantly losing people and going, oh, I wish I could find out what happened to her. And by the end, no one's story is, I think, left kind of alone. As I say, I like an ending where it feels like all the bones, everything gets tied up with a bow. So you do get to see what happens to everyone by the end.
Can I ask you, what are some endings that sort of frustrated you, or whether it's a book or a movie, what are some endings that, made you want to do the opposite? Like, what was the inspiration for sort of, because I feel the same way. There's certain endings, I think, in literature and in films where it makes sense in a way because it's sort of, whether it's a thriller or they have something coming up or whatever. But I think there's a way to deftly, close the piece of work while still having this sense of, and it goes on and you can imagine other things. And that's what I think you did really well. So I'd love to know sort of some of disappointing endings in your world.
So I'm going to be quite Pollyannish, and I'm not going to criticize any other authors.
Yes,
but I will say I didn't love the Game of Thrones ending, because that's an ending to me. To be clear, the show, I love the books. The books haven't ended yet. But in the show, it to me felt so rushed and not really believable. And it didn't, it felt like you'd been setting up this story. The ending, though, like, it doesn't actually ring true. Whereas if I think of some of my favorite books, I think Station 11 has a really great ending. Yes. I think it's an ending that really comes together. Station 11, Emerson Bell, really novel. That was definitely a real inspiration in terms of an ending to aspire to. And if I think about the books that I read as a child that really had an impact on me, I grew up as part of the kind of Harry Potter generation. I was born in 1993.
I was born in 94, so yeah.
If you are someone who read Harry Potter as a child, right? It just has such an impact on your writing, because those were the books we were all obsessed with. And those books, and also the Noel Streatfeild, Ballet Shoes and White Boots, they really do have endings.
I love those books too. Yeah.
Very much planned from the beginning. You see how you ended up there. They're some of my absolute favorites. So I think that those books inevitably had a really big impact on how the kind of narratives that I personally like to read and tell.
Yeah, I have to say I've never watched Game of Thrones, which I know is like a big and I know then once people started to talk about how disappointing the ending was, and I mean, I'm sure I've read inadvertent spoilers, but like I know the characters, I don't really know what happens in it, but I'm almost like, do I even want to? I know that the majority of the show is really great, and there's a reason why people love it, but I'm like, if it ends so unsatisfactory, like, do I really want to watch it? I don't know.
If it was up to me, I would recommend, and I say that as if I'm not now going to recommend you what to do, but the books are really brilliant. So if you like fantasy, the books are fantastic. And I read the books before I watched the show, which I think was a good call. So I read all the books, and then I would then watch the show and then stop at the end of season 5. And if you do that, you're like, oh my God, this is an amazing adaptation.
Then pretend that the other ones don't exist.
Pretend the end doesn't happen. And exactly. And then just wait for the next book to come out. But the books are, I mean, there's a reason why they've sold so many copies. They are just, like, it's very difficult to build a world quite that big, I think. But still have it feel in any way engaging, and yet it really does.
I know it's been a while. I think I read a lot more world building fantasy books when I was younger. And I think I still love the fantasy genre, but I definitely tend to read more sort of like one-off novels, or even if it's a young adult novel, like something that's less concerned. Like the world building is harder to get in just a 300 or a 400 page novel versus if someone's really committing to a series. Like, I don't know, did you ever read any of the Tamora Pierce novels? I forget, she did a bunch of like world building with medieval, and then also there was the Deltora Quest novel, which were like for children, but those were sort of like a finding the stones in the world. And so I need to revisit. Maybe I should check out the Game of Thrones books, because it's been a while since I've really like delved into a really intense world building fantasy series.
I have not read Tamora Pierce, but you're not the first person to recommend that to me recently. A friend of mine who reads a lot of fantasy actually recently said that I should read those. And also I've been recommending Sarah J. Maas to everyone. I swear to God, her books got me through the pandemic. And they're really
Sarah Jane Maas?
Sarah J. Maas, Maas. She wrote a series called Throne of Glass, which is 8 books, and another series called A Court of Thorns and Roses.
Oh, I've seen people talking about, I mean, I'm in some like book Facebook groups and whatnot, and people love A Court of Thorns and Roses. I've heard very good things about that.
I so recommend. I started reading them in August and promptly became obsessed. It is now June 2020.
Okay, I got to check them out. There's 8 of them.
They're really good. So there's 2 series. There's 5 A Court of Thorns and Roses books, and there are 8 Thread of Glass books. So plenty to keep you going.
Yes, that's quite. I don't know if you're familiar. Have you seen the TV show Black Sails?
I have not. No. What's
Okay,
that?
I'm gonna blow your mind. It's and also I mean your accent, of course, is reminding me. So it's about pirates in the golden age of piracy, and they it's the prequel to Treasure Island. So it's about how Long John Silver got to be who he is and how Captain Flint got to be who he is. And it is one of the best. I mean, my boyfriend watched Game of Thrones and he said that it was comparable, if not better, because speaking of endings, I won't give anything away, but the ending of it, because it does have to tie into what the audience is, of course, familiar with the Treasure Island novel, and that is in the canon of society. And so it really gives a beautiful ending of like how everything wound up into how it is. And it takes a lot of historical fiction, but also it's a little bit speculative. And your accent is reminding me of Eleanor Guthrie, who's the governor's daughter. But it was on Stars, but it's out there on streaming. So I highly recommend checking it out. And then the ending is one of the best endings I've seen on TV ever.
That sounds right up my street. Duly noted.
Yeah, you got it. It's really, yeah. And then maybe you'll be like, I sound like Eleanor Guthrie. But I think it's the ending is because they have an ambiguous ending, and of course you sort of know what happens to some of the characters, but I think it's cool when it's cool, but it's also hard when, especially with Game of Thrones too. I think did the ending differ from the book ending? Is that why people were so upset?
So the books haven't ended yet.
Oh, okay, so that's why.
No, exactly. But the ending was just not. It was just not the ending that people wanted. But we actually don't know what the ending's going to be. And my understanding is that George Martin said, that his ending might be a bit different. So I live in hope.
Okay, so there is still hope for the series as a whole to have a more conclusive ending, even if it's on the page and not on the screen. Okay, that makes a lot of sense then. If people were disappointed, yeah, at least he has a chance to redeem himself. But I thought if it was an ending that the writers just sort of came up with, then it feels even more gratuitous. It's like, how can we pander to the audience? But clearly it didn't really pay off.
Indeed. To be fair, I suspect it was a slightly thankless task coming up with any ending to something that popular.
Yeah, it's also it's hard. That's what it's hard too, is like it's the calculation of really how you're gonna disappoint someone inevitably, but it seems like it was such a global disappointment that it's like, ooh. What would be your nightmare virus, and how do you think that you would respond to a similar sort of pandemic? I mean, obviously you could speak about your actual experience during COVID and how you handled that, or how you would handle something that's even, arguably a little bit more terrifying and a little more, I mean, not to discount the horrors and the deaths of the COVID pandemic, but I think it's even more terrifying to think about, literally 90% of men dying. So what would be your sort of like nightmare pandemic?
I mean, I think that the pandemic in End of Men is quite possibly up there. And it would be that very odd. On one hand, I would know that I was not going to die, but I would be so terrified for my brother and my dad and my friends, and so much would change. I think actually in Station 11, I think it's like 99.999% of the population dies. And so society really does cease to function because you don't have oil or plastic, or agriculture. There are not enough humans to kind of keep society going. So I think maybe that is the absolute nightmare, in that it's terrifying to me, the concept of life as we know it truly changing. And that's one of the things I think about COVID, that as much as it has been awful, and I've been very fortunate that I haven't lost anyone, my granddad is happily vaccinated, my family's all vaccinated, me, my mum, my sister, my brother all had COVID, but happily haven't got any long-term side effects. But I think that throughout it, as awful as it's been so extraordinary to see, for example, that vaccines have been invented and the hospitals have continued function under frankly impossible circumstances, but at least it has felt like society to some degree has continued. And I think people have been very resilient about that. There's been, for example, like I was watching ballet being live streamed from my house when we were all obviously kind of on lockdown, and restaurants were still doing kind of takeaway food, and there were these small things that became disproportionately important, I think, when it felt like life was ending. Whereas it is, to me, unimaginable to, for example, in Station 11 land, if you are one of the people that survives, to then have a world fundamentally different, and it's never ever going to be back, the way that it was.
And having that memory though of what the world was, I think is so, because you have to wonder about like, how is humanity going to live on? And if there's 99.9% of the people are dead, at least there's still always going to be men and women. I think that's why it's so important. You did keep that 10% of men, because not only is the population, having to move on from this, but it's also going to continue in one way or another. And, reproduction is like part of life. And how do we deal, humanity would literally die out, I think, if we just didn't have enough men and women.
Exactly. So at least there is a sense that things would continue. Obviously, there is a huge amount of difficulty, but there is enough. There's enough for hopefully long term for society and for the world to continue.
And how do you feel about like sort of not necessarily pandemic inspired, but more like dystopian, like Blade Runner type? I've been thinking, spending a lot of time thinking about these like futuristic societies that on the one hand seem so technologically advanced and we've eliminated a lot of things, but I feel like a lot of the humanity is gone in those senses of the world. And while it may on paper look like it's a lot more productive, we're really replacing humanity with technology. Like, what are your feelings on that sort of, potentially trending way that society is going?
Worrying, I suppose. And I wonder if that's partly because I feel like whenever AI, for example, is discussed in like newspapers, it's often in a very negative way.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that critically, but we talk about jobs to be lost, which is obviously really scary, or mistakes that are made. And it's one of those topics that I kind of wish I knew more about. It's not a type of fiction that I'm drawn towards, I think, because I find it quite scary and I don't understand it. So it's not something I think I would ever write about. I quite like writing super hyper realistic fiction, which I feel is like, I suppose, quite close to what we are now. So you feel like the thing in the world could potentially be happening now. Whereas I suppose to me, that does still feel, I suppose, 20, 30 years down the road, doesn't it? The idea of
that's what's crazy is I think Blade Runner takes place in like 2019 or 2020 because it came out in the early 80s. And you're like, oh, we've already passed that. And while, I live in Los Angeles and Blade Runner takes place in Los Angeles. And so while it's definitely not exactly what they think, we're not flying in the sky and it's still weird though, because there are some restaurants where it's like, now you don't have a person, like, you just touch on a screen and you don't need a person. And you could argue that on the one hand, that makes society more productive and more streamlined, but also we're losing that humanity. And I think that's what's almost like scary. That's what's so scary for me is losing humanity while we still have the option of humanity. It's like we're purposefully choosing to neglect it as opposed to like, we have no other choice.
I agree. And I think that one thing that you can see with the pandemic is how much value we all have, quite rightly, on human interaction. Actually, as much as it's wonderful that we can do events and things, online. And I think it's really important for accessibility reasons.
Yes.
That we continue having the availability of those. But I do hope that we move towards a hybrid where it's completely acceptable, for example, for someone to do something online. We have those, events that are live, for example, should, I think, be filmed and streamed.
Yeah, like why weren't we doing that before? Like people are like, oh, this is such a novel.
With my friends, it really didn't. Sorry, I lost you there for a minute.
Oh no, I was. No, it's okay.
It doesn't replace real life interaction. Seeing people online is an additional extra, but it is really important, I think, to have interpersonal things. So I completely agree. And to me, for example, supermarkets is a big one. I don't know if you have this in the US, but in the UK, we now have primarily self-checkout where, there's a machine and you just do it yourself. And when I was growing up, I remember my mum is really chatty. She's like a really, really chatty person. And, it would always be a thing where you'd be like getting your stuff from the supermarket. For the week, and you'd have a chat with the supermarket checkout person. And that was a really nice interaction. And I just remember my mum always like making conversation with them. And I then worked in retail when I was a teenager. And it is so odd to me that even that small thing that I think felt quite dystopian a decade ago is now just completely common across the UK.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure most of them are like half and half. And it's, interesting. I would always make the choice of like, okay, well, the self-checkout line is shorter, but every so often it's like, okay, well, if you have an issue, like, it scans something wrong or you don't want the item, then you have to wait for a person to come over. So sometimes it's like, we're sacrificing the humanity component of it, but it's also not perfect too. And then it's the humanness of the imperfection, I think, is what gets lost with the robots, because or the AI, because it's just black and white. It's like, okay, it made a mistake, versus if it's a human and they say, oh, okay, I just need a price check, you're a lot more understanding, versus if the machine is like beep, 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 then you get a lot more frustrated at it. And then it makes you in like a worse mood, because you're like, why can't this robot just help me check out with groceries?
That's true. I think we have so much more compassion, hopefully, for people. And I find it really interesting that one of the most popular books of the last year has been Clara and the Sun.
Yeah. Have you read that?
I haven't. I've actually borrowed it from a friend.
I loved it. It was really good.
And obviously, anything Kazuo Ishiguro writes will be amazing. Yes, but I find that the topic he's chosen to write about most recently has been AI, and I think that kind of says a lot about its kind of place in the cultural zeitgeist at the moment.
And he's literally, I mean, I won't give any spoilers, but this one literally deals with the humanness of an AI, and the, lots of novels and pieces of literature, deal with AIs in one way or another. But I think to really grapple with the question of like, what makes humanity, and what makes a relationship, and like what makes a friendship, and what makes someone a person, and how can AIs sort of navigate that way. He's just like fantastic. I also feel like there was a lot of like I don't know if you've probably gotten this comparison, but like Black Mirror, it sort of rang true in that kind of sense of I love Black Mirror because sometimes it deals with the technology AI pieces, but then sometimes it also just deals with what happens when humanity goes off the haywire, and finding those bits and pockets of the humanity and the goodness amongst the darkness. Have you watched the show?
I was like, you know what, this is too good. Like, it was too believable. I found it quite scary. And I'm aware there's a real irony to me saying that as someone who writes arguably quite terrifying speculative fiction. But
and I was going to say, your book is probably more terrifying than most of the Black Mirror episodes, I have to say.
I think also because I spend so much time obviously thinking about these dystopian speculative worlds, writing them, it often means that when I'm reading, I want to read something that is quite comforting. I really like historical fiction for that reason, because it feels very separate. So I started, and it is by all means absolutely excellent, and then went, do you know what, I'm writing a second world, read something different or watch something different.
Well, you should definitely, my favorite episode is called White Bear. And that's definitely more of a humanity focused one versus a technology focused one. So if you did want to revisit one episode, that's the one I recommend. What else are you reading, and what sort of is your, you said you like to sort of stay away from the more scarier realistic things, which I totally get. So what's sort of like been your comfort reading? What have you been watching? What's been keeping you sane during, as we're still sort of in this pandemic and on the tail end of it, but I think everyone is still spending a lot more time at home than they normally would. So what's been keeping you sane?
A big Marvel catch up. I love Marvel films, and I remember watching the first like Iron Man at the cinema, and then over the last few years I've been so busy that I kept going, I really want to enjoy them, and I just didn't have time to the cinema. So I had this really lovely time of catching up on like Captain America, Civil War, and the last two Avengers movies, and Doctor Strange with one of my best friends, which was so lovely and a really nice thing to do each week when we were here in the UK. And then books wise, I've read a lot of fantasy and a lot of historical romance. They are completely immersive, and when it's felt like everything's really, they've just been a real way of completely escaping the world. As I said, Sarah J. Maas has been a big one. I'm a really big Julia Quinn fan, who is now really famous from Bridgerton. She was always famous, I think, as a romance novelist, but she's obviously one of the most famous authors in the world, and I really recommend her books. They're just such a joy.
So she has other series besides the Bridgerton ones, right? She's like a huge author, I think.
28 novels, and I've read all but 3. I've only got 3
impressive. That's pretty impressive. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. I think, wherever you're at in your life, however the pandemic has affected you, because it's affected everyone in some way or another, I think that this is it's so multifaceted, because whether you've lost somebody, whether, you had positives come out of this, whether you had, the worst year of your life, I think everyone can find something relatable. And then also, again, really just that hope, and that sort of realistic hope too, because it's not all sunshine and rainbows, but it's not the end of the world. It's sort of, this is keep calm and carry on.
Good advice for both life and indeed, I think, the characters in The End of Men. Keep calm and carry on.
Well, this has been wonderful. Christina, thank you so much. And until next time, everyone, stay reading.